1979. The last black-footed ferret officially dies in a laboratory. For decades before that, biologists had searched every corner of the Great Plains. They found only 9, and all of them perished. Then, unexpectedly, a dog named Shep brought home a dead black-footed ferret. The find led scientists to a colony of 129 animals. The problem was that plague had broken out among them. Over a single summer, the population fell to 58 ferrets, and by autumn, even lower. Time was nearly gone. By 1987, only 18 animals remained alive. That was when America took an extreme step. All the ferrets were trapped and removed from the wild. The species had to disappear from nature in order to have any chance of surviving in captivity. And the hardest part of the rescue was only just beginning. The black-footed ferret is the only ferret native to North America. At the start of the 20th century, their numbers ranged from 500,000 to 1 million, and the entire Great Plains, from the Canadian prairies to the Mexican plateau, belonged to them. Small nocturnal hunters with distinctive black masks, they hunted underground and vanished before dawn. Then came the farmers. The prairie dog, the ferret's primary prey, was declared a pest, and farmers methodically poisoned entire colonies to protect crops and pastures. 112 million acres of native grassland were converted to farmland, and when the prairie dogs disappeared, the ferret began to disappear with them. In 1964, when the government was already preparing to officially declare the species extinct, a small population was unexpectedly found in Millette County, South Dakota. That was the first chance at survival. In 1971, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service captured 9 animals for a breeding program, but almost immediately, catastrophe struck. 4 ferrets died after receiving a canine distemper vaccine that proved lethal to them. It was then that scientists first understood how sensitive this species was to the substance. All 9 eventually died. The last wild population was seen in nature in 1974. And in 1979, the last black-footed ferret in captivity died at the Patuxent Research Center in Maryland. The search continued for several more years and yielded nothing. Most scientists finally gave up. Dean Biggins did not. The young biologist had spent years driving fruitlessly across Wyoming in search of any trace, and then Shep laid a dead animal next to his food bowl, and everything changed. The news spread quickly. Biologists converged on the hog ranch and began sweeping the pastures with flashlights at night. Dean Biggins, the young biologist who had spent years driving fruitlessly across Wyoming looking for any sign of the species, was among the first to arrive. One evening, as he and his colleague Steve Martin drove slowly across the pastures of the Pitchfork Ranch with a spotlight mounted on the roof of the car, a pair of eyes suddenly flared in the beam. Biggins later described it as a bright turquoise-green reflection unlike any other animal. The ferret crossed the road and disappeared into a burrow. By 1984, the count had reached 129 individuals, the population peak. Before long, Mititsi had become a word known to every wildlife service in the United States, and scientists from around the world were coming to the hog ranch. John Hogg, an ordinary rancher, suddenly found himself at the center of the greatest zoological discovery of the decade. "Every damn man in the world wanted to be Mr. Ferret," said neighboring rancher Jack Turnell about what was happening around him at the time. Turnell managed the Pitchfork Ranch, where most of the colony lived, and joined the Species Recovery Advisory Group himself. Locals nicknamed him the Green Cowboy, and he did not object. This was an example of how you can protect an animal without taking away oil, gas, timber, or jobs, he said later. But while everyone argued over who had the right to save the animal, the disease was already moving. In 1985, biologists detected sylvatic plague fleas in the colony. The same bacterium, Yersinia pestis. In the 14th century, it had killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population, destroying more than 20 million people in 5 years. Then it disappeared from view for a few centuries and reappeared in the late 19th century. Between 1899 and 1900, infected rats aboard ships from Asia arrived at ports in California, Washington, and New York. Fleas jumped from the rats to local rodents, and the disease quietly spread across the western grasslands. Prairie dogs had never encountered this pathogen, and mortality during an outbreak could reach 100% of a colony. The ferret ate prairie dogs, lived in their burrows, and was infected by their fleas, making plague a double death sentence because it killed directly and simultaneously stripped away both food and shelter. The population dropped from 129 to 58 individuals in a single summer, and then canine distemper struck from above. Biologists understood that if they did not act immediately, everything would disappear again, and this time permanently. Between 1985 and 1986, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service trapped the last animals alive, 18 black-footed ferrets, all in cages, none remaining in the wild. This was the entire population of the species on Earth. But 18 was not 18. When scientists examined which of them were capable of breeding and producing genetically diverse offspring, only 7 proved to be viable founders. The new species would have to begin from them, which meant that every ferret born after 1986 would be genetically as close to one another as full siblings. One new disease, one unfamiliar pathogen, and the population could collapse again. Scientists saw this problem clearly, but no solution existed. In 1986, during the first full year of the captive breeding program, not a single kit was born. Scientists simply knew almost nothing about the reproductive biology of this species. Previous attempts to breed ferrets in captivity back in the 1970s in South Dakota had ended the same way. Kits were born and died. Now, 18 of the planet's last animals sat in cages at the Sibyl Canyon Research Facility and produced no offspring. Domestic ferret breeders and reproductive biologists from zoos were brought in, diets were reviewed, housing conditions changed, and video surveillance cameras installed. In 1987, 2 females became pregnant simultaneously. 8 kits were born, 7 survived. One of the mothers was named Jezebel. She did not display the maternal instinct the staff expected, did not gather the kits or keep them together, but staff watched through the monitors and did not intervene. 7 survived. After that, progress accelerated. 34 kits in 1988, 58 in 1989, 66 in 1990. In 4 years, from zero to a functioning program reliably producing dozens of animals per year. Jezebel lived for 8 years, far longer than the average wild ferret lifespan, which rarely exceeds 1 year. When she died in October 1995, her extended family numbered approximately 450 descendants. Tom Thorne, a veterinarian with Wyoming Game and Fish, said simply after her death, "If those 18 had not been taken, the species would be gone." Saving the ferret turned out to be impossible without simultaneously saving the prairie dog. The ferret lives exclusively in prairie dog burrows, raises its young there, and builds its entire survival cycle around those underground tunnels. 90% of its diet consists of prairie dogs, and without them the ferret has neither food nor shelter. But prairie dogs had been exterminated for decades as pests. Farmers poisoned them, shot them, collapsed their burrows, and even in the era of Western settlement, they were officially classified as enemies of pastureland. When plague arrived, it finished what people had been doing for years. This meant that the ferret recovery team had to simultaneously work on restoring prairie dog populations, fighting plague outbreaks, finding suitable grassland sites, and conducting lengthy negotiations with landowners willing to accept an officially endangered species on their land, with all the legal restrictions that entailed. 4 tasks, 1 species, 0 margin for error. Autumn 1991. Shirley Basin, Wyoming. 49 young captive-bred ferrets were preparing for their first release into the wild. Before release, every animal went through a mandatory boot camp, a minimum of 10 days in cages placed directly above real prairie dog colonies, to acclimatize to the smells, sounds, and environment in which they would have to live. Researchers found that ferrets with this preparation survived in the wild 3 times longer than those released without it. 49 ferrets stepped into the grassland. At least 4 survived the winter, and the following summer 2 females produced litters right in the wild prairie, the first ferrets born free in 6 years. Someone on the team said afterward, "We didn't expect it to happen that fast, but the joy was brief." Yersinia pestis had gone nowhere. It lives in the soil, in fleas, in hundreds of rodent species across the plains, and an outbreak can only be detected once a colony is already dying, because before that there are no visible signs. Scientists found a partial answer. In 2010, researchers developed an oral plague vaccine for prairie dogs in the form of peanut butter-flavored bait, blue in color so both biologists and the animals themselves could see it. Drones scatter the baits across colonies, 50 per acre, at a rate of 40 to 50 acres per hour. It is, in a way, a medieval bacterium up against peanut butter and an 8-rotor drone. But every spring, the prairie dog population doubles, and most newborns have never seen the vaccine. Scientists estimate that a colony remains vulnerable for a minimum of 6 to 7 months per year, and the bacterium is in no hurry. Shirley Basin, the first reintroduction site, peaked at 193 individuals in 2006. By 2017, the count was 16. Plague struck the prairie dogs, and the ferrets lost food and shelter and everything else simultaneously. New reintroductions, new counts. Then in 2013, in partnership with the organization Revive and Restore, the Wildlife Service began thinking about a solution that no one had ever attempted. December 10, 2020, a conservation facility in Carr, Colorado. An animal named Elizabeth Ann was born. She was a genetic copy of a female named Willa, a ferret that had died in Wyoming in the 1980s without leaving a single living descendant. Here is how Willa came back after more than 30 years. In 1988, Oliver Ryder, the director of genetics conservation at the San Diego Zoo, asked researchers to send tissue samples from ferrets for preservation. A piece of Willa's skin without any particular hope and simply as archival material was frozen at the San Diego Frozen Zoo, where it remained for 32 years. In 2013, Revive and Restore, via GenPets and the Wildlife Service decided to attempt cloning. A nucleus from one of Willa's cells was inserted into a domestic ferret egg cell after its own nucleus was removed, and a domestic ferret served as the surrogate mother. Ryan Walker, Viagen's science director, said they were thrilled, or rather ecstatic, when Elizabeth Ann was born. It was the first successfully cloned endangered species native to the United States. Willa, considered permanently lost, had been waiting in a freezer for 32 years, but Elizabeth Ann never produced kits. She was found to have a physical uterine defect unrelated to the cloning itself. Her clones Noreen and Antonia, born in 2023, proved more successful. In June 2024, Antonia raised offspring of her own, and for the first time in American science, a clone of an endangered species had produced living descendants. Willa's genes, belonging to an animal that had left no living descendants for 40 years, were now circulating in the population. Willa officially became the 8th founder of the species. Before her, there had been 7. More than 11,000 ferrets have been born in breeding programs since 1987. Approximately 5,500 of them have been released into the wild at 34 sites across 9 states, as well as in Mexico and Canada. Between 400 and 500 individuals now live in the wild. The most successful site is Conata Basin in South Dakota, near Badlands National Park. In 2007, the count there reached 355 ferrets, an absolute record for a single site. Then plague struck in 2008, and by 2013, only 49 remained. By the end of 2023, the population had recovered to 160, roughly half of the entire wild population on the planet in one place. In November 2023, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service adopted a rule expanding designated reintroduction zones by 184%. More land, more potential sites. But every new site is a separate conversation with a separate landowner. In the summer of 2025, 4 more litters were born, 6 females and 6 males, from Antonia, Noreen, and Antonia's own offspring. Willa's genes, belonging to a ferret that died in 1988 without a single descendant, are now being passed on in the 3rd generation. For the species to officially cease being classified as endangered, 1,500 adult individuals are needed across 10 or more populations in at least 6 states. Currently between 400 and 500, more than ever, but less than a third of the goal. The Lazy Beavy Ranch, autumn 2018. Alan and Christine Hogg stood on the plateau alongside game and fish biologists and several dozen people who had come to watch the release. It was not the first time. The initial 35 ferrets had returned to the ranch in 2016, with smaller groups every year after. "We're old pros now," Alan Hogg told a journalist that evening. At the first major release in 2016, organizers brought exactly 35 ferrets, one for each year since Shep had brought in the first animal. They presented the hog family with a taxidermied ferret, the very one they had never been able to keep for themselves back in 1981 when the taxidermist picked up the phone. One of the females released in 2016 was named Lucille by the hog family, after Lucille Hogg, the woman who had once wanted a taxidermy mount. The following summer, it was she who produced the first wild offspring on that land in 30 years. Lucille the person did not live to see it, but the ferret bearing her name gave birth to kits on the same grassland where everything had started. Shep simply brought home what he had found and laid it beside his bowl. Everything else was done by people who decided, this is enough to begin.